The sun hung low over the town of Pinecrest, casting long shadows on the streets as the evening rush began. It was an ordinary day for the residents of this small, close-knit community. People moved through their routines with the kind of ease that only familiarity can bring. Sarah, a young disabled girl in her early 20s, was no different. She had long brown hair that she often kept tied back in a neat ponytail, and her bright, intelligent eyes were filled with curiosity about the world. Sarah had been born with a condition that left her unable to walk, but she never let it define her. Every day, she navigated the world with the help of her service dog, Charlie, a loyal golden retriever who had been her companion since she was a child. Sarah's bond with Charlie was unlike any other. He was more than just a service dog, he was her protector, her confidant, and her best friend. They moved through the world together, Charlie guiding her with patience and understanding, always by her side when she needed him most. Together, they could go anywhere, do anything. Sarah knew that as long as Charlie was with her, nothing was impossible. That day, Sarah and her caregiver, Mrs. Thompson, were heading to the local grocery store. It was a small, family-owned shop just a few blocks away from their home, one that Sarah had frequented for years. The routine was comforting, a small piece of normalcy in an often uncertain world. As Sarah wheeled herself along the sidewalk, Charlie trotted beside her, his leash taut but never pulling. He had been trained for this, knowing when to stay close, when to lead, and when to watch for potential hazards. Today, the weather was perfect, clear skies and a gentle breeze. A perfect day to run errands, to be out and about, to feel like any other person in the world. Meanwhile, Officer Thomas, a 40-something cop who had recently been promoted to patrol sergeant, was having a far less peaceful day. The radio crackled intermittently in his car as he drove through the quiet streets, a dull hum in the background of his thoughts. He had always been the kind of cop who prided himself on following the rules. He believed in order and discipline, in doing what was right no matter the cost. But recently, something had begun to change inside him. The constant stress of his new position was wearing him down. His marriage was strained, his relationship with his teenage son was faltering, and his job, which had once brought him a sense of pride, now felt like a never-ending burden. He longed for a sense of peace, something to help him feel in control again. It was in this state of mind that he found himself driving down Pinecrest's main street, trying to push the gnawing feeling of dissatisfaction from his mind. He had been assigned to a routine patrol, something he had done countless times, but today it felt different. Maybe it. He had been assigned to a routine patrol, something he had done countless times, but today it felt different. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the weight of everything in his life coming to a head, but his nerves were on edge. He couldn't shake the sense that something was off. As he rounded the corner, his eyes briefly caught sight of Sarah and Charlie, just a few yards ahead of him on the sidewalk. Sarah had just made her way to the crosswalk, Charlie alert beside her, ready to guide her across the busy intersection. She wasn't rushing, just moving at her own pace, confident in the steady rhythm of her wheelchair's wheels turning over the pavement. Mrs. Thompson, walking beside her, chatted idly with a passerby, oblivious to the approaching danger. Officer Thomas, still preoccupied with his own thoughts, had no idea how close he was to an incident that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The crosswalk signal blinked green, and Sarah began to make her way across the street. Charlie stayed close, as he had been trained to do. But just as Sarah was halfway through, Officer Thomas, seeing a gap in the traffic, made a quick decision. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator to quickly pass through the intersection, not noticing how close Sarah and Charlie were. The tires of his patrol car screeched on the pavement as he sped toward them. Charlie, ever the watchful protector, darted forward to keep pace with Sarah, sensing the danger a split second too late. In a blink, the patrol car struck Charlie's back legs with a sickening thud. The impact sent the dog sprawling, yelping in pain as he tumbled across the street. At the same moment, the momentum of the car caused it to veer slightly off course, and the right front tire rolled over Sarah's wheelchair, breaking the fragile frame and throwing her forward with a violent jerk. The world seemed to slow down for Sarah. She felt the sudden, jarring pain as her chair tipped and she collided with the pavement, her hands instinctively gripping the sides of the broken chair. The sound of Charlie's yelps echoed in her ears, but her mind couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought to stay upright. She felt disoriented, confused, and terrified, but it was Charlie's cries that tore through her. She turned her head in time to see him lying motionless in the middle of the street, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. "Charlie," she screamed, her voice cracking. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to sit up, the realization sinking in that her world had just shattered. She reached out for him, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The pain in her wrist where the chair had broken, the confusion, the shock, it was all too much. Mrs. Thompson rushed to her side, her face pale with fear. She bent down to help Sarah, but all she could do was look helplessly at the scene before her. Officer Thomas, now fully aware of what had happened, had stopped his car several feet away. His hands trembled on the wheel as he stared out through the windshield. The shock and horror on his face mirrored the chaos unfolding in front of him. He had been so distracted, so caught up in his own world, that he had failed to notice the one thing that should have been his focus, the vulnerable girl and her dog. Now, it was too late. He got out of the car, his heart racing in his chest. His footsteps were heavy, slow, as he approached the scene. "Oh my God," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't see you. I didn't mean to." But his words fell flat. There was no undoing what had been done. Sarah's father, FBI agent Samuel Wright, was halfway across town when he received the call. It was his worst nightmare, his daughter's voice, trembling on the other end of the line, saying that something had happened to Charlie. He had barely heard her words before he had grabbed his keys and rushed to his car. The drive to the scene felt like an eternity, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. His mind raced through 100 different scenarios, none of which seemed real. It couldn't be happening. By the time Samuel arrived at the scene, the area was already crowded with onlookers, some whispering, others glaring at Officer Thomas, who stood awkwardly by his patrol car, his head hung in shame. When Samuel stepped out of the car, the world seemed to stop. He saw Sarah, still on the ground, her face pale and tear-streaked, her hands clenched tightly around the ruined wheelchair. Charlie was still lying in the street, his breathing shallow, but there was no movement, no sign of life. "Sarah!" Samuel rushed to her side, kneeling down and pulling her into his arms. He held her tightly, not knowing how to comfort her, not knowing what to say. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" But even as he asked, he knew the answer. His gaze shifted to Officer Thomas, who was still standing by the car, his face a mix of confusion, regret, and guilt. There was no question about it, this was a nightmare for everyone involved. But for Samuel, it was more than just a terrible accident. This was his daughter's life, and the man responsible was a cop, a symbol of authority and protection. That made it personal. Samuel's mind clicked into gear. He had been trained for high-stress situations, but nothing could prepare him for what was unfolding before him. There would be no easy answers here. There would be no simple solutions. The events of that moment would set a course for everyone involved, one that would alter their lives forever. As he looked down at his daughter, struggling to comprehend what had just happened, Samuel knew one thing for certain: things were never going to be the same. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, he steeled himself for what was to come next. The question now was, how far would he go to get justice for his daughter? The scene around them was chaos. People had gathered in small clusters, some in hushed conversations, others watching in stunned silence as Sarah sat on the ground, her face still pale from the shock. The pain in her wrist and the overwhelming sense of loss were unbearable, but it was the lifeless body of Charlie lying in the street that consumed her every thought. The world had gone quiet in that instant, as if all the sounds of the city had been drowned out by the weight of her grief. She could feel the sharp sting of tears in her eyes, but she held them back, not wanting to let her emotions spill out in front of so many strangers. It felt like a betrayal to Charlie somehow, as though her sadness might somehow add to the injustice he had already suffered. Her father, FBI agent Samuel Wright, stood beside her, the protective instincts of a father flooding his chest. His mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts, all crashing together in a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and disbelief. He knew that his daughter's world was in shambles, but he also knew that the moment he had arrived at the scene, things had changed forever, not just for Sarah, but for the officer responsible. His mind shifted back and forth between two very distinct realities, as an FBI agent who understood the complexities of the law and as a father who was determined to protect his daughter at any cost. The balance between the two was delicate, and he wasn't sure how to proceed. His eyes moved to Officer Thomas, still standing by his patrol car, his posture stiff, his gaze lowered in what could only be described as shame. But shame wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. Not after what had just happened. Samuel's gaze hardened. He could hear the sounds of the sirens growing louder in the distance, the familiar wail of emergency vehicles that had become all too common in his line of work. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't a criminal scene he was walking into. This time, it was personal. "Sarah," Samuel said softly, his voice filled with an unspoken promise of protection, "I need you to stay strong for a moment. I'm going to take care of this." He squeezed her hand gently, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure who he was comforting more. He stood up slowly, looking. The scene. He couldn't help but feel a pang of anger, how quickly people jump to record tragedy, to turn someone's suffering into something to be watched from the comfort of their screens. He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on what needed to be done. Officer Thomas was still standing there, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly. The guilt was written all over him, but Samuel knew better than to assume that guilt alone would lead to justice. He approached him slowly, his footsteps measured and deliberate. When he was close enough, he stopped. Officer Thomas glanced up, his eyes wide, as though he hadn't expected Samuel to approach him directly. His voice was shaky when he spoke. I didn't mean to," Officer Thomas stammered, his words almost lost in the noise of the crowd and the wailing sirens. "It was an accident. I swear, I didn't see her or the dog. I thought I was clearing the intersection." Samuel's gaze didn't waver. He had dealt with many criminals in his career, and he knew the language of guilt when he heard it. But that wasn't what concerned him. What concerned him was the fact that an officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, had allowed his personal turmoil to cloud his judgment in a way that led to his daughter's suffering. It wasn't an accident, it was negligence. "You killed my daughter's dog, officer," Samuel said, his voice low but carrying a weight that only a father's pain could bring. "And you broke her wheelchair. That's not an accident. You failed to see the situation, and now my daughter's life is changed forever. There's no excuse for that." Officer Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fail him. He shifted his gaze to Sarah, who was still sitting on the ground, trying to stay composed as she wiped away the tears that had finally started to flow. Seeing her, her pain, her suffering, it made Officer Thomas's guilt even more unbearable. He had never been one to shy away from responsibility, but this felt different. He had taken an oath to protect, and now, he had done the exact opposite. "I swear," Officer Thomas said again, his voice breaking, "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't see her, and I couldn't stop in time. Please, Samuel cut him off, his voice firm, unyielding. "You're not going to talk your way out of this, officer. You're not going to fix what's been broken with some empty words. You've taken something that can't be replaced. The officers who had arrived on the scene were starting to cordon off the area, but Samuel didn't look at them. His entire focus was on Officer Thomas, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. Samuel's mind worked quickly. He was an FBI agent, yes, but he wasn't above using his knowledge of the law to ensure that justice was done. He needed to know what happened, but more than that, he needed to make sure this officer faced the consequences of his actions. His daughter would never be the same after this, and neither would he. He couldn't let this go unnoticed. You're not getting away with this, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying an air of finality. I'll make sure of it. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of promise. Officer Thomas's face paled even further. He was a cop, yes, but in this moment, he was just a man who had made a catastrophic mistake. And Samuel, as a father, was determined to make sure he paid for it. As the other officers continued to assess the situation, Samuel felt his anger simmering beneath the surface. But more than that, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. His daughter had been hurt, her world turned upside down, and it was his job to ensure that the person responsible would answer for it. He had always prided himself on being able to compartmentalize his work and his family life, but today, there was no separation. This was personal, and no amount of professional distance could. And as Samuel turned back to look at Sarah, who was now in the back of the ambulance, Charlie's lifeless body being carefully loaded into the vehicle, he made a silent vow. He would make sure that her pain did not go unanswered. He would make sure that the man responsible faced the consequences, no matter what it took. No one was going to walk away from this without understanding the full impact of their actions. The damage had been done, but Samuel Wright was determined to make sure justice would be served. The night was just beginning, and the repercussions of this moment would echo through the community for a long time to come. Change that. In the distance, Sarah's soft sobs reached his ears. His heart broke for her, but he knew he couldn't fall apart now. He had to be strong for her. He had to be the rock she needed. As much as he wanted to hold her in his arms and make the world right again, he knew that wasn't possible. But he also knew that what was possible was making sure this officer, this man who had taken something irreplaceable from his daughter, would face the consequences of his actions. As the evening unfolded, the situation began to escalate. News vans arrived, reporters gathered at the edges of the crowd, and a sense of urgency began to permeate the air. Samuel knew that this story was going to be bigger than just one officer's mistake. This wasn't just about a dog or a broken wheelchair. This was about accountability. It was about the price of negligence and the repercussions that followed. The days that followed the incident felt like a blur to Sarah. The community that had once seemed so familiar to her now felt foreign, a place where whispers and stares followed her wherever she went. The sight of Charlie's empty leash still hung around her wrist, a cruel reminder of the dog that had been more than a pet. He was her constant companion, her protector, the one who helped her navigate a world that had often been unkind. And now, Charlie was gone. The wheelchair she had relied on for years was damaged, its wheels no longer turning as smoothly as they once had. But it wasn't the physical damage that weighed on her so heavily, it was the emotional devastation that had taken root in her heart. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see it, the moment Charlie was struck, the helpless way he collapsed under the weight of the officer's vehicle. The image would replay in her mind, over and over again, like an endless loop that couldn't be stopped. Sarah had tried to keep it together. She had tried to be strong, to push through the grief. But the truth was, she didn't know how to move forward. Not after this. Samuel, too, was struggling in his own way. As an FBI agent, he had faced countless challenges in his career, but nothing had ever felt as personal as this. He had stood in courtrooms, interrogated suspects, and solved cases, but none of it had prepared him for the helplessness he felt now. He had spent hours on the phone with his colleagues, trying to figure out how to proceed with the investigation, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. The officer who had struck Charlie had been placed on administrative leave, but Samuel knew that wasn't enough. This needed to be more than just a story about a cop who made a mistake. This was about accountability, and the damage caused by that mistake reached far beyond just his daughter. The media coverage of the incident was relentless. News vans were parked outside their home, reporters camped out on the street, their cameras trained on the windows of the Wright household. Samuel had tried to keep a low profile, but the nature of the case made that impossible. It was clear that the public was hungry for answers. Some outlets focused on the emotional aspect of the story, painting a picture of the grieving family, while others were quick to dissect the incident from a legal standpoint, questioning whether the officer had acted recklessly or whether there was more to the story than met the eye. Samuel knew that every word spoken in the media could potentially affect the outcome of the investigation, but he couldn't escape the fact that his daughter's pain had become a spectacle. It was one thing to be a father standing up for his child, it was another entirely to have the world watching, judging, and speculating on every action taken. As Sarah sat in her room one afternoon, staring blankly at the wall, her phone buzzed with a message. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to open it. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was Officer Thomas. Sarah had been avoiding him. She didn't want to hear his apologies, didn't want to listen to his words of regret. She had seen enough of that from people who didn't truly understand the depth of what had been lost. But this message felt different. She opened it slowly. "I know I can't take back what happened," the message read. "But I need you to know that I am so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I can't stop thinking about what happened, and I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry for the pain I've caused." Sarah stared at the message, her fingers trembling as she held the phone. She hadn't expected this, at least, not in this form. There had been no phone calls, no face-to-face apologies, just this message from a man who, a few days ago, had been the one to destroy her life in an instant. She couldn't decide if she was angry, hurt, or numb. Maybe it was all three. Her father had warned her about forgiveness. He had told her that sometimes, there was no room for forgiveness when someone's actions had irreversible consequences. But Sarah wasn't sure she could hold on to that anger forever. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with all the pain and confusion that had been dumped onto her lap. She knew that no apology, no matter how sincere, would ever bring Charlie back or fix her broken wheelchair. But a part of her wanted to believe that Officer Thomas felt some measure of guilt, some recognition that what he had done had been wrong. She typed out a response, unsure of how her words would come across. "I don't know what you want me to say," she wrote. "You took my dog, my life, and I don't know if I'll ever be okay again. I don't know if your apology changes anything, but I just wanted to tell you that I can't keep pretending like this doesn't matter. It matters. And I don't know what happens next." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then tossed her phone onto the bed. It was an honest response, but it didn't feel like enough. Nothing felt like enough. The days stretched on, and the tension between father and daughter became palpable. Samuel had taken it upon himself to pursue every angle of the case, but as time passed, he began to realize that there were forces working against him. It wasn't just the police department's internal investigations that stood in his way, it was the pervasive influence of the system itself. His colleagues in the FBI, those he had once trusted, were suddenly becoming more distant. Some of them were trying to avoid the case altogether, citing conflicts of interest, while others seemed to be purposefully slow-walking the investigation. The truth was, Samuel had seen this before. He had seen the way the system sometimes protected its own, how officers could sometimes be shielded from the consequences of their actions. But this wasn't just any case. This was his daughter. His family. And he would not let anyone sweep this under the rug, no matter how high up the chain of command it went. The stress was beginning to take its toll. Samuel spent hours on the phone with his contacts, trying to get a straight answer from anyone who might help. His mind was clouded with the constant pressure, but it was the thought of his daughter, sitting in her room, dealing with her own internal turmoil, that pushed him forward. He needed to be there for her. He needed to make sure that no one would forget what had happened, not the officer, not the department, and certainly not the community. One evening, as Samuel sat at the kitchen table, flipping through case files, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. "Samuel Wright?" a voice on the other end asked. "Yes," he replied, his voice tight with suspicion. "This is Detective Lisa Moore from the local police department. I've been following the case, and I think you deserve to know the truth about what happened. You're not going to like it." Samuel's heart raced. He had always known that there were secrets hiding in plain sight, but this felt like it was about to change everything. Detective Lisa Moore's voice on the other end of the line seemed to tremble, but her words were sharp, deliberate. "I know you're angry, Samuel, and I can't even begin to imagine what your family has been through, but I need to tell you something about the officer involved in the incident. There's more to the story than you've been told, and it's not just about an accident." Samuel's mind raced as he leaned forward in his chair. He knew this was the break he had been waiting for, but the implications of what he was hearing were both frightening and unsettling. "What do you mean, more to the story? Are you telling me there's something I don't know?" "I believe so," Detective Moore continued, her voice lowering as if to make sure no one else could overhear her. "This isn't just about an officer who lost control and hit your daughter's dog. That's part of it, sure. But there's something deeper at play here, something that might have been intentionally covered up." Samuel's pulse quickened. He glanced over at Sarah's empty wheelchair, its damaged wheels lying still in the corner of the room. He had suspected for days that there was more going on, but hearing it from an inside source made the whole situation feel even more out of control. "Who's covering this up? And why?" Samuel demanded, his voice rising in both anger and fear. "Is the department involved in this?" "It's not just the department, Samuel," Moore responded. "It's bigger than that. You need to understand, this isn't a case of one officer making a mistake. There's a systemic issue here. I don't know how far up the chain this goes, but I can tell you this, Officer Thomas wasn't supposed to be there that day. He was under pressure from someone higher up. There's talk about him being set up, though I don't know the full story." Samuel sat in stunned silence. The words she was saying didn't make sense, but he could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. Officer Thomas was involved in something bigger? How was that possible? And why would someone want to target his family in this way? "I don't know if you're ready for this," Moore said, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. "But the officer wasn't the only one involved. There's a bigger case here, one that could change everything." Samuel's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean a bigger case? What is this about?" "I can't go into full details, not yet," she replied cautiously. "But I need you to meet me. I have evidence that can help you, but it's not safe for us to talk about it over the phone. If you trust me, you'll meet me at the old warehouse on 4th Street tonight. I'll be there at midnight. Don't bring anyone with you, just you." The call ended abruptly, leaving Samuel with 1,000 questions and a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had always known that there were things about this case that didn't add up, but now, it seemed like the rug was being pulled out from under him. What kind of evidence could Detective Moore have? And who was involved in this conspiracy? The night dragged on as Samuel wrestled with his thoughts. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were slowly beginning to fit together in his mind. He had to go. He had to see for himself what this detective knew. But the thought of walking into a potential trap made his skin crawl. Sarah was already so fragile, he couldn't put her through more, especially if this led to more danger. At midnight, Samuel pulled into the parking lot of the warehouse, the area shrouded in darkness. The building loomed in front of him like a ghost, abandoned and decaying. The air was thick with tension, and Samuel's breath felt shallow as he stepped out of his car, his hand instinctively reaching for the holstered gun on his hip. It wasn't that he expected to need it, but in this world of secrets and lies, it was better to be prepared for anything. The creaking sound of the warehouse door echoed in the silence as Samuel approached. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, whether this was an elaborate ruse or an honest attempt to reveal the truth. But as he entered the dimly lit interior, he was met with the sharp, familiar figure of Detective Moore. Her expression was grave, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for threats. "You came," she said, her voice low and serious. "I came. Now tell me what's going on. Who's pulling the strings here, and what does this have to do with my family?" Samuel demanded. Moore nodded, taking a deep breath before she spoke again. "The officer involved in your daughter's case, he wasn't just some rookie making a mistake. He was being manipulated. You see, Samuel, this entire thing was orchestrated to force a reaction from your family, and from you specifically. Officer Thomas was given orders to take action against you. The hit on your daughter's dog was never just an accident. It was a message." Samuel's heart pounded as he tried to process the words. A message? A targeted attack on his. The next few days felt like a blur for Samuel. He was consumed by the weight of everything that had unfolded, the threats against his family, the shocking truth about Officer Thomas, and the terrifying realization that there were people in positions of power who were willing to destroy lives to protect their secrets. His mind spun with the knowledge that he couldn't trust anyone, not even law enforcement. The truth was buried deep, and it was up to him to dig it up. He couldn't keep this to himself any longer. Sarah needed to know, even if it would hurt her. The reality of their situation was overwhelming, but she had a right to understand the danger they were in. As the days passed, he found it harder to sit in the same room as her without feeling like he was lying to her, holding back information that could protect them both. One evening, after Sarah had finished her therapy and they sat together in the living room, Samuel turned to her. She had always been his rock, her resilience in the face of her disability inspiring him more than he could ever express. But now, as she looked at him with her trusting eyes, he felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't told her the full story. Not yet. "Sarah," he began, his voice unsteady. "There's something you need to know. Something big. It's about what happened with the dog, and the officer." Sarah looked up at him, her expression filled with curiosity. "What do you mean? I thought we were just trying to move past it." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't planned on revealing the full extent of the situation just yet, but the time had come. He knew he couldn't shield her from the truth any longer. It wasn't just a random incident, Sarah. The officer didn't just lose control. He was following orders. Orders from someone high up. Her face fell, her eyes widening as she processed his words. "Orders? What are you talking about? Who would want to hurt us like that?" Samuel's voice cracked as he explained, each word feeling like a weight on his shoulders. "There's more to this than just an officer making a mistake. Someone wanted to send a message. They wanted to hurt us. And it's not just about the dog, Sarah. It's about something much bigger." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before continuing. "I've been talking to Detective Moore. She's been investigating things from the inside, and she believes that this is part of a larger conspiracy. The officer who hit the dog, he didn't do it on his own. He was manipulated. And now, he's trying to make things right, but he's scared." Sarah's hands gripped the armrest of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she processed the information. "Are you saying that they're after us? For real?" I'm saying that this goes deeper than just an unfortunate incident, Sarah, Samuel replied, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know who's behind it yet, but I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'll make sure they pay for what they've done. The silence between them was thick, each of them trying to absorb the weight of the situation. Samuel could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, but there was something else there too, determination. She wasn't going to sit idly by and let their lives be torn apart. I want to help, she said quietly, her voice steady, even though her hands shook. Whatever it takes. Samuel looked at her, a mixture of pride and fear swelling in his chest. He had always admired her strength, but now he saw just how much this situation had changed both of them. They were no longer just victims of a random act of violence. They were involved in something far greater, something dangerous that could threaten everything they had fought for. And yet, Sarah wasn't backing down. Sarah, I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Samuel said, his voice firm. We'll face this together, but I need to protect you. I can't risk you getting caught up in this any more than you already are. She shook her head, her determination unwavering. You can't protect me by keeping me in the dark. We're in this together, Samuel. I'm not afraid. I'll fight with you every step of the way. Samuel closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had known his wife was strong, but seeing her ready to fight with him brought both relief and sorrow. They had fought side by side through so much already, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight to expose a conspiracy that threatened the fabric of their lives. They spent the next few days quietly preparing. Samuel reached out to Detective Moore again, insisting that they meet, but the danger of their situation became more apparent with each conversation. He could feel eyes on him, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He was certain that someone was aware of what he was uncovering, and they weren't going to let him get away with it. As Samuel made his way to the meeting spot that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. Every corner he turned seemed to hold a threat. The night air was thick with tension, his every step echoing in the empty streets. As he approached the alley where he was supposed to meet Moore, he caught sight of a shadow darting across the street. His heart raced as he reached for his gun, instinctively taking a defensive position. But the figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be none other than Detective Moore. She was visibly shaken, her usually confident demeanor replaced with a sense of urgency. We don't have much time, Moore whispered as she motioned for Samuel to follow her into the alley. They're on to us. I think they know what we're doing. Samuel's mind raced. What do you mean? Who's on to us? Moore glanced around nervously before speaking again. There's a mole in the department. Someone inside the force is feeding information to those behind this. And they're trying to cover up everything. Samuel's blood ran cold. The walls were closing in faster than he could keep up with. His every move was being watched, and the people behind this conspiracy were willing to go to any lengths to protect their secrets. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't. The cost of failure was too high. I need you to be careful, Samuel, Moore warned. They're willing to kill to protect what they've built. And they're not afraid of taking anyone down, even if it means destroying everything they've worked for. Samuel nodded, steeling himself for what lay ahead. I'm ready. Let's expose them. As they continued down the alley, the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. Someone was following them. Someone who was clearly intent on stopping them. Samuel's heart pounded as he glanced over his shoulder. But it was too late. The figure emerged from the shadows, gun drawn and ready. Before Samuel could react, a voice rang out from the darkness. Get down. The gunshot came too fast, and Samuel barely had time to duck before the bullet whizzed past him. The world exploded into chaos as Moore pulled him to the ground, shouting for him to stay low. The sound of more footsteps, and then more gunfire, filled the air as Samuel tried to regain his bearings. This was it. The final push. The battle for truth. But Samuel knew, deep in his gut, that the danger had only just begun. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the air thick with tension as Samuel and Moore scrambled for cover. The muffled echoes of gunfire were enough to send chills down his spine. Samuel's mind raced. Whoever was after them had no intention of leaving them alive. They had crossed a line, and now, the consequences were becoming all too real. Samuel pressed his back against the cold brick wall, heart hammering in his chest. His mind replayed everything that had led to this moment. He had uncovered a massive conspiracy, one that reached deep into the heart of the police department. He had made enemies with some of the most dangerous people in the city. And now, they were fighting for their lives. Detective Moore's face was grim, her expression unreadable as she peered around the corner, her gun in hand. She gestured for Samuel to stay low. "We can't stay here long. They'll keep coming until they get us. We need to move." Samuel nodded, eyes scanning their surroundings. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the walls. He could hear the distant sound of sirens, but they weren't close enough to help. It was just them, and whoever was hunting them. "We need to get to the safe house," Moore whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "It's our only shot." Samuel didn't hesitate. He trusted Moore. He had to. She was the one person who had been with him every step of the way, despite the risk. Together, they had uncovered a trail of corruption that was as deep and dangerous as any he could have imagined. But they had one final piece to find, the one person pulling the strings. Once they had that, everything would fall into place. But right now, survival was the only thing on their minds. They moved swiftly, keeping low and avoiding any unnecessary noise. Samuel's mind was racing, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. Every step was a gamble. One wrong move, and they would be exposed. As they turned the corner and ducked into a side street, Samuel caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the shadows, just out of reach. His pulse quickened. Was it an ally, or an enemy? He motioned for Moore to stay back and crept closer, trying to get a better view. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, but Samuel's instincts told him it wasn't a threat. As he stepped closer, the figure finally spoke. "You're in danger. They're on your tail," the man said, his voice low and urgent. "Get to the car. I'll cover you." Samuel didn't question it. He didn't have time to. He could tell the man was serious, and the warning alone was enough to convince him. They sprinted down the street, staying close to the buildings as they headed toward the parked car just ahead. Samuel's heart was pounding in his ears, but he kept his eyes forward, determined not to let anything distract him. As they reached the car, the man opened the door, and Samuel and Moore jumped in, barely managing to close the doors before the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. The car screeched to life, tires squealing as they sped away from the alley. Samuel barely had time to catch his breath before he heard the man's voice again. "Where's the safe house?" the man asked, his hands gripping the wheel as they raced through the city's winding streets. "We're close," Moore replied, glancing at Samuel. "Just a few more blocks." Samuel nodded, gripping the seat as the car swerved around a corner, narrowly avoiding an oncoming vehicle. His thoughts were clouded, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he tried to process what had just happened. They were on the run. The conspiracy they had uncovered was far-reaching, far more dangerous than they had initially realized. The forces behind it weren't just trying to silence them, they were willing to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. As they neared the safe house, Samuel's mind wandered back to Sarah. He hadn't been able to tell her everything. He hadn't had the chance to warn her about the danger that was lurking, waiting to strike. His mind replayed her words from earlier, her unwavering determination to fight by his side. But the situation was far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. He couldn't bear the thought of her being caught in the crossfire. He needed to protect her. No matter what it took. The car screeched to a halt in front of a nondescript building, its windows dark and uninviting. Moore jumped out first, scanning the area to make sure they weren't being followed. Samuel followed closely behind, his hand on the grip of his gun, ready for whatever came next. They moved quickly, entering the building through a side door that led down to a basement. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the smell of dust and stale air. A few other figures were already waiting, their faces shrouded in shadow. One of them, a man in his mid-40s, stood up as Samuel and Moore entered. "Glad you made it," the man said, his voice gruff. "We've been waiting for you." Samuel exchanged a look with Moore before speaking. "What's the situation? Who else is involved in this?" The man gave him a grim look. "The entire department is compromised. The mole we're looking for is much closer than we thought. We've traced the money back to a few key individuals, but there's no time to waste. They know we're coming." Moore's face hardened. "So it's not just about the dog. It's about something bigger." The man nodded. "Exactly. They've been running this operation for years. The officer who killed the dog, he was just a pawn. But now, he's seen too much. He's trying to back out, but they won't let him. They'll do anything to keep their secrets." Samuel felt a surge of anger. His family had been caught in the middle of something they hadn't asked for. This wasn't just about revenge for his dog. This was about exposing a system of corruption that had infected everything around him. "We need to stop them," Samuel said, his voice cold. "We can't let them keep getting away with this." The man's eyes locked onto Samuel's. "That's why you're here. We've got a plan, but it's going to take everything we've got. And if we fail, they'll come for us. All of us." Samuel didn't hesitate. He had already lost too much. His world had been shattered, and now he was fighting to piece it back together. He would do whatever it took to bring justice to his family, and to the countless others who had been hurt by the people in power. "This ends tonight," Samuel said, his voice steady with resolve. The group moved quickly, preparing for what would be their most dangerous mission yet. As they gathered their equipment and readied themselves for the final confrontation, Samuel's mind raced. He was no longer just a man trying to protect his family. He was a man determined to bring down a corrupt system, and nothing, not even the threat of death, was going to stop him. They were about to make their move. And the city would never be the same again.